Alrighty then. Credits. At last. It's kind of a shame that I did not, or not, I did not, but I was not capable of beating this on Friday because it would have been another like 45 minutes plus whatever I had to say. That being said, I was able to write down my thoughts on Friday, which um, is kind of it's like a lose-win scenario, because I had not written down my thoughts previously. Anyways, Final Fantasy X-2 conquered. Um, just to throw it out there, I'm not really a fan of this ending. I don't think this ending really like resolved um the the conflict per se. I I I wanted more out of that, especially considering Vagnagun. But uh, at if not even that, just give me a concert at the end. End the game in a similar fashion to when you started the game. You can even have LeBlanc there, and it can be an ensemble thing. Do I gotta? Do I gotta? Well, I gotta mute this for the YouTube side anyway, so just reduce that volume for the stream, and it can be loud for me. Um, so for my overall thoughts, I'm gonna take a slightly different approach here in the formatting, only slightly. But as I was playing this game, there was something that that kind of clicked with me, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but that question is, who is this game for? Final Fantasy X is regarded as many people's favorite Final Fantasy game. It tackles a tough journey of a young woman who has placed the world's fate on her shoulders and is out there making decisions for the survival of the living peoples. She struggles to vocalize her choice of sacrificing herself to someone she has grown close to and fully realizes that her sacrifice is just a temporary measure. Someone who will need to show up, or someone else will need to show up someday and conduct the same sacrifice. While I don't feel that Final Fantasy X properly illustrates and conveys those thoughts and feelings to the player of the game, it is certainly how I felt the intended direction was going. Final Fantasy X-2 is the corrupted thought that Yuna is a strong leader and character, and that could carry a story significantly less serious and tackle significantly less real choices. Yuna, who is the somewhat shy but determined summoner, gets 2 years to overcome the loss of Titus, who was someone she at the very least liked, but likely loved. She gets 2 years to deal with the loss of Auron, a huge mentor and gateway to who her father was. She gets 2 years to overcome the complete destabilization of the religion in the world, which is something she herself caused by choosing to break the cycle. 2 years to delve deeper into her Al Bhed heritage, where she can not only grow closer to Riku, but also Cid and their way of life, both old and new. 2 years to help shape the world as one of the most powerful and influential people in the entire world, instead of tackling all these powerful moments for a character who deserved to have that moment of triumph, self reflection, and realization that the world is changing and she can change it further, for better or for worse. She decides she's going to go look for Titus, who no longer exists. She becomes a sphere hunter that seeks out VHS tapes in sphere form, which is oddly some new profession that just magically manifested itself in those 2 long years. She teams up with Riku and Brother to complete the mission. In doing so, despite appearing to have shut herself away and be said, has grown into a very bubbly and outgoing person, willing to make off the cuff decisions for the sake of discovery. And then the Final Fantasy X-2 game actually starts, and we're watching Yuna sing a concert, and Riku and Pain are beating people up. Even with the revelation that it's LeBlanc, the whole time singing, it's just an insanely jarring experience to be a part of. And that ultimately is what Final Fantasy X-2 is, extremely jarring. Yuna is leading a team in all but name, but hasn't grown to be a leader, nor expresses any leadership traits. The structure of the game is divided into individual missions, which involve silliness, hijinks, and buildup of the overarching narrative. The combat system is completely revamped to be something new in application and implementation, going as far as to do active time battle with new systems attached. Characters of Final Fantasy X return to some degree and are utilized as nostalgia punching bags or callback generators. Some characters are fleshed out to a greater degree, except that they are made more annoying than they originally were, such as Brother and Riku. There's this narrative that 3 factions now rule the world and are basically in a civil war, all in the span of 2 years, and none of these characters are old or influential figures. They're new. Hardly anything game mechanics wise is explained in the game, creating a lot of room for extrapolation and confusion in comparison to the otherwise simple and understood system Final Fantasy X implements. Ultimately, Final Fantasy X-2 creates an unfair experience based on, or unfamiliar experience based on an experience I believe they expected you to be familiar with. When doing so, it is done with an unlikable cast, unlikable interactions between friendly, unfriendly, and villain characters, and presents itself as more lighthearted. It lacks the depths for its characters. It effectively retcons the established lore and feasibility of that lore's progression, and it structures the game in a way to promote bite-sized adventures. It fails to meaningfully add something of value to the Final Fantasy X mythos, which brings me back to my original question. Who is this game for? Excluding everything that I've just said, Final Fantasy X-2 presents some very interesting and potentially satisfying aspects, however. Dress spheres are a very cool idea and add so much depth and character, or depth to characters and customization. Despite how individual abilities being learned is still a mystery to me, I like that they can be learned in combat and points are automatically assigned to the next available thing to learn. Garment grids provide even more complexity and customization to the point where you can accomplish very cool things by switching dress spheres. A departure of the equipment system with abilities and instead assign greater values to dress spheres and accessories. A mission-based system where, in many, if not all, reward in a meaningful way that is actually cool. These typically include dress spheres and garment grids, but there are probably other rewards as well. And a combat system that presents many challenging aspects. Choose the right dress sphere for the right moment while casting spells and abilities that affect future planning. There's also a monster catching system that you can add monsters to your party in place of Yuna, Riku, or Pain. And those monsters can equip dress spheres, which is pretty cool. But even with those elements, Final Fantasy X-2 just ultimately doesn't accomplish anything I had hoped to see from it. The game is presented from an angle where it removed itself from its predecessor to become a spin-off, with Yuna being a singer, then immediately kills that off. The allure of doing something completely new with little to no connection of the previous game felt like a good direction to go. The story is basic and underdeveloped. Characters don't grow, narratives don't flow, and the overarching plot is an immense stretch. It demands so much hand-waving that it rivals the ramification you think of, with Titus and Jecht being what they are. Character interactions felt devoid of substance. Every interaction with LeBlanc and her cronies were just a waste of time, which could have been spent actually developing the three major factions. Shu Yin and Len's inclusion are also beyond silly. Even if you navigate around Shu Yin's existence and Len being trapped in a dress, an entire machine complex existing beneath Bevelle with a machina capable of destroying the world is pretty crazy. There's no way you can convince me that the antagonists of Final Fantasy X didn't know about this and didn't try to exploit it if they did know about it. This is also to say nothing of Yuna's plan to stop Shuyan by telling him Len loves him, which, is typical JRPG ridiculousness. There's the active time battle system. That is just not something I gravitate to. Every millisecond I spend not selecting an action is just me being punished, and I feel enough bosses ticked the obnoxiousness factor that made me enjoy it less. If it wasn't for Yuna's super form, I'm not sure I could have made it to where I got, aka beat the game. I don't actually feel the battles encourage dress sphere swapping as well. In fact, I think battles actively punished me for trying out new things or trying to have characters be in dresses with low HP. And as a side to that, Festivalists felt very strong. Good hit point values, solid offensive stats, and the ability to heal itself while also removing debuffs at the same time. It got to the point where I felt like that was all I needed to progress battles. So if we circle back to my original question, who is Final Fantasy X-2 for? One would think it would be anyone and everyone who enjoyed Final Fantasy XIII-2 and Lightning Returns. I actually find it pretty staggering how many comparisons these three games have with each other. Yet they all essentially share the same problems. In some ways, it feels like it's a miracle we got Final Fantasy XII. I want to expand on this a little bit as well, because the similarities between those like three add-on games, you could arguably take the approach that these games, both systems-wise and approaches to how like disconnected they want the narrative and how they want to utilize the characters from the original game to be, like nostalgia punching bags, or the other thing that I said that I don't remember. But it's quite fascinating to me that Final Fantasy X-2 is basically just like the first iteration of Final Fantasy 13-2, and Lightning Returns is just like the third game in that series. There's clothing swaps, there's monster catching and adding monsters to battles. There's a narrative that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. There's this utilization of the old characters in a way that doesn't feel satisfying to someone who wants to see those characters progress or grow in a second game. There's the added addition of playing characters that you may not be all too attached to. And there's the added addition of playing characters through a story that doesn't give the gratification to those characters in particular. So it's super fascinating to me that these games share so many qualities together. It's pretty crazy. And to continue, I would certainly believe it's not for anyone who found value in Final Fantasy X and its approach. It attempts to straddle the line between being a continuation or sequel, but also a spin-off. This indecisiveness effectively created a situation where the game could only be unlikable. I want to expand on this a little bit too, because I I look at Final Fantasy X and I see the ideas, I see the direction, I see where they wanted to go, and it didn't hit the mark for me, but I recognize what it was trying to do. Final Fantasy X-2 doesn't do any of that. It doesn't build upon the previous game. It it tries to do something completely different, but it still wants to be attached to the older game. And so it just it does like this ping pong thing where it's like remember Final Fantasy X and don't remember Final Fantasy X. We're something totally different, and it's kind of annoying. Um, I like I said, if this game had just committed to the idea, I mean, and obviously this was probably not the intended idea, but if it just committed to the idea that Yuna was a singer going around the world or something like that, and it was just a complete spin-off, that would have been fine. It would have been its own thing. And you don't have to call back to all this other stuff and 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 bring Final Fantasy X as like an underlying plot that's important. You can just continue with Yuna doing something different in like this alternate universe. So it's either that option or you actually build upon the previous game. Like I said, you have that 2 year span of where the world is going to change, and it's going to change massively. And completely disregarding the fact that 2 years is not a very long time. Um, Yuna is probably the most important figure in the entire world and likely has the most influence out of everyone. She should have been able to. So it's a little crazy to me that after the events of Final Fantasy X, she just goes home and just chills, and lets the world destroy itself or fall into the civil war that's going or whatever. And then just one day Riku shows up and is like, "Hey, want to be a sphere hunter?" And she's like, and Yuna replies, "Nah." And then she finds a sphere with uh Titus in it, and she's like, "Yeah." And it's like, come on, what is wrong with you? You know, there's a really cool story in here of someone who changes the world, and now the entire world is on her shoulders, and she has to rebuild it because she's the one who did the task. And why couldn't we just get a continuation of her doing that? It's so sad. But to put a cap on everything, Final Fantasy X-2 is certainly not for me. This is the first game in some time where I not only contemplated quitting it, but was also willing to follow through with said quitting. I knew I was in trouble based on the very first mission of the game on Mount Gagazet, and it only went downhill from there. All right, those are all of my written thoughts. To go back down some of the normal format, story was it satisfying? Absolutely not. Did it feel complete? I'm going to say no. The entire story here was basically we need to stop Vegnagun, and we didn't get any conclusion on Vegnagun. Um, we don't know if it's destroyed. We don't know if we took it apart. We don't know if we took it apart and cast the pieces into space. If we melted it down, I don't know. How was the pacing? The mission structure of this game makes the pacing absolutely terrible. For gameplay mechanics and design, I'm going to skip down to cardinal sins. There's no value indicator or tell to determine enemy HP. The caveat here is Libra does exist, but you have to, as far as I can tell, recast Libra to get that information. And the more I'm experiencing this with games, the more I don't think it's acceptable because, especially in a game like this, where it's an active time battle, it's it's important to have the information. And if you're going to make me invest in getting that information, I shouldn't have to invest in it again or further times after that to see that information again. Um, Positional damage without the ability to reposition. I'm not 100% confirmed on this, but there were some instances where enemies were casting spells that seemed like AoE spells, and sometimes characters would be in these weird places and uh, they would not get hit with those same spells. So that makes me believe that that's a thing. Main story missions, there's side quests, plenty of those. Unskippable cutscenes before a boss, a lot of those. For miscellaneous sound and music, the music of this game was mostly flew under the radar for me. I think I've listened to this soundtrack before because that final Vegnagun fight, I've heard that song before. It's like The Great Lion or something like that, I think. Um, and you know, I like that track, but I don't remember a lot of memorable tracks. The Celsius theme, I think that one was, if I'm remembering the one correctly, I think that one was pretty enjoyable as well. For graphics were fine. Voice acting was mostly okay. There were some instances of uh, some of that 90s flair of we don't know our voice direction, so we're just going to sound a little monotone here and hope it covers all our bases. Uh, for other, if it's a sequel, does it achieve more of the same? Absolutely not. It does not. Is the game worth recommending? So here's an interesting thingamabobber here. Despite my feelings on this game, I think if you properly conveyed to somebody that Final Fantasy X-2 has absolutely nothing to do with Final Fantasy X, and it's just a completely different game with a completely different tone, I could see this game being recommended. I I hear the 100% for this game is insane. Um, the combat system seems to have some depth to it, even if I felt a considerable amount of punishment for engaging in that depth. Um, I think the general mechanics are pretty cool, even if they don't explain them. I think there's a lot of um, secondary and tertiary systems that all kind of combine to make a very fascinating experience for somebody. So I could actually see myself recommending this to someone. I wouldn't recommend it to someone who places a lot of value on story, but I think someone who wants to experience something uh, different in a gameplay sense that is not so traditional would probably enjoy this a lot. And if the developer is watching, I don't think I have a a way to kind of like re-summarize everything, but I think where I would go with this is I for me personally, this just went in the completely wrong direction. It didn't tackle the story that I had hoped to see. It did not tackle the spin-off uh, game that I was hoping to see. Did not expand upon the characters in a way that I was hoping to see. It just it, and it's not a thing of me going into this game with expectations of seeing that. It's it's in the sense of if I'm playing a sequel to the game, whether it's intended to be a sequel or not, I don't know if 10.2 is officially quote unquote a sequel, but if I'm going into a game with that, I'm expecting some familiarity, some ties to the original game that make it uh, I guess like justify its existence and things like that. Like carry on the narratives and whatnot. And since we're still operating with some of the same familiar characters and whatnot, um, that's just the innate base values of what I was expecting, and we didn't get that. So, uh, would I want a sequel? Probably not. Not probably not. Anyways, to reiterate my overall thoughts, I didn't really enjoy this game all too much. Um, I, I, there were times where I actively despised playing this game, but I will give this game credit that the more the game went on, the more the plot actually started to surface. And while I wasn't necessarily interested in the plot and how the plot resolutions were being devised, the the introduction of those plot elements and seeing those plot elements uh, complete and then move on to the next one actually kind of brought a little bit of revitalization towards my interest. It still wasn't enough for me to like the game. I think the beginning of it with the hijinks and LeBlanc and fighting her cronies uh, 500 times or whatever, it was just too much. It was way too lighthearted and silly for me when Final Fantasy X is very much not that. So yeah, I didn't enjoy this game at all, really. I mean, if we gotta lay all the cards on it, I didn't really enjoy it at all. But it did have some very cool mechanics and design ideas that I would say I would like to see in the future. But I've seen how they're used in the future, and it doesn't really work out for the future. So I'd like to see this kind of stuff in other games. Some maybe some indie games or something like that. I think uh, there's room for iteration on the Dress Sphere system. But yeah, I think that is all of my thoughts. So I'm gonna end the thoughts here. Let's press a button here. Oh, okay, okay, okay. I'll we'll we'll tack this on to the end there. Tack this on. This is helpful information. 46% story completion. Um, play through the game again using all the dress spheres and items you collected and all the abilities you've learned. Find and complete missions you may have missed and write a whole new story. I only did half the story. I did less than half the story. Isn't that wonderful to think about? You go through all the main story uh, quests slash missions in a video game that you play, and you are notified that you did less than half of the story. That's that's a as Dante would say, big think.